Next, importantly, we will address the underlying causes of environmental issues. We address this a bit differently than your textbook. Your textbook says resource depletion and pollution are two of the causes. I disagree, and I argue that those are two general types of environmental issues, not causes. What are the underlying causes of resource depletion and pollution? Why do we deplete resources? Why do we pollute? Pause the video and brainstorm some reasons. Again, don't brainstorm types of pollution or examples of resource loss. Instead, try to get at why this happens. Hopefully you've come up with at least a few ideas of why we have environmental issues. On the next few slides, I've listed 8 underlying causes for environmental issues as presented by students in previous semesters. Some of the reasons overlap a bit, but I think they're all worth mentioning and studying. Here they are. First, rapid human population growth. Second, poverty. Third, non-sustainable consumption, particularly in the global north. Fourth, failure of economic and/or political systems. Fifth, worldviews, values, and ethics. Sixth, failure of the media. Seventh, lack of education or miseducation. And eighth, social traps. So we're going to go through each of these, and perhaps you've come up with some of your own. First, rapid human population growth. This is a central problem that underlies many or most environmental issues. We will discuss population growth in more detail in a couple weeks. But for now, let's consider the current world population of about 7.3 billion people. Imagine if we only had half that many people. There would certainly be less stress on our natural resources and less pollution, right? Incredibly, our Earth had half as many people quite recently, sometime in the mid-1960s. That means we have doubled the world population in about 50 years. Yikes! Wow! Check out this graph from Chapter 4 of your textbook. It shows how the number of people on Earth has changed over time. Notice the dramatic increase in the last few hundred years. We're in a period of experiencing exponential growth, which we'll discuss in more detail in a few weeks. Technology, education, etc. can dramatically reduce our resource use and pollution, but rapid human population growth makes it difficult to reduce or even stabilize resource levels and pollution levels. Let's check out just how fast our population is growing. Here's a link to the U.S. Census Bureau population clock. I encourage you to check it out. I'm showing it here below. Check out how fast our world population is growing. I encourage you to write down the world population number you see and check back periodically throughout the semester. It's stunning. Notably, the numbers you see here are for June 11th, 2017. So you can, if you're doing this the first day of class, you can compare the population numbers to what it was just a day or two ago. Human population is not growing uniformly around the Earth. Some countries are actually declining in population, while others are growing at lightning speed. This simple graph shows that most population growth is occurring in the less developed regions of the world, while the more developed regions are growing slowly. Graphs like this make it easy to demonize the lesser developed regions and effectively blame them for current and future resource depletion and pollution issues. That's not really appropriate. Many of these rapidly growing countries are experiencing what we might call people overpopulation. They have more people living on the land than the land can support. However, each individual person is consuming and polluting very little. On the other hand, there's another type of overpopulation, consumption overpopulation. In this case, the country may have few people, but each person uses more than their global share of resources. I bet you can guess what country would be a good poster child for consumption overpopulation. Yep, us, the United States. Most of the resource depletion and pollution in the world to date is due to consumption overpopulation, not people overpopulation. Also worth considering is what happens when the lesser developed countries, or countries like China, start using resources and polluting at the same per capita rates as we do. And why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't families in China have 2 or more cars and entertainment systems and everything we have? Is that kind of wealth only for us? Anyway, you can see that something needs to change. Countries that are currently experiencing consumption overpopulation need to take a second look and take action. Let's revisit our list of underlying causes of environmental issues. Thus far, we've just addressed human population growth. Now let's look at poverty. If you took the time to look deeper into the Brundtland report that we mentioned a little while back, perhaps you found their discussion on the causes of non-sustainable development. Basically, the Brundtland report stated that critical global environmental problems were primarily the result of enormous poverty in the global south and non-sustainable patterns of consumption and production in the global north. Poverty is a condition in which people cannot meet basic needs for adequate food, clothing, shelter, education, or health. Poverty drives people to use resources in an unsustainable manner because they need to do so for their own survival. It forces people to choose short-term solutions, even though they may be able to see that the choices are not sustainable over the long term. As an example, I used to work for an international nonprofit that promoted using the power of the sun to cook food, Solar Cookers International. More than a third of the world uses wood to cook their food, and in many places of the world this wood use is simply not sustainable. Forests have disappeared, resulting in desertification and climatic changes. Also, the women who collect the wood likely have an understanding that the depletion of wood resources is not good, but their immediate choice is to feed their families or to not feed their families. Survival wins. Wood is collected. From that same quote in the Brundtland report, we can see that non-sustainable consumption, primarily in the global north, is an underlying cause as well. By the global north, we typically mean North America, Canada, Europe, Japan, and some other parts of Asia. So why do we have this non-sustainable consumption? Is it lack of education, which is one of our other causes? Is it a failure of our economic and political system, which is another one of our causes? Is it a product of our values and worldviews? Or is it something else? Next, let's look at number 4, the failure of economic and/or political systems. I probably should have made this phrase a bit longer. It should probably say the failure of economic and/or political systems to encourage Earth-sustaining growth and to discourage Earth-degrading growth. We'll cover this concept in more detail in the coming weeks, but for now let's simply consider the economic system of market capitalism. For a product to be priced correctly, all of the costs of production must be considered in the purchase price. Costs of production of a product typically include raw materials, labor, transport, packaging, marketing, etc. If that purchase price is low, lots of people will buy the product. If the purchase price is too high, fewer people will buy it. Unfortunately, our current version of our capitalistic economic system does not do a good job of including all the costs of production into the marketplace. There are hidden costs associated with resource depletion and pollution that are not included, so the price is actually artificially low, and people end up buying more of the item than they would if all the costs were properly included. Consider oil, an easy target. Gas prices are fairly low, but if all environmental and health costs were included, what would the price of gas be? Costs currently not included in the purchase price of oil and gasoline might be things like oil spills, air pollution, health effects of air pollution, like lung disease and asthma and cancer, the loss of tourism or fisheries jobs when there's been an oil spill, etc. Who pays these costs? Not the people consuming the product, but instead the people who live or work near refineries or oil spills. Going further, it's not too much of a stretch to consider military costs, both monetary and cost of lives as well. Would we really be involved in as many geopolitical conflicts in the Middle East if that region exported carrots rather than oil? If associated military costs were put into the price of a gallon of gas, what would it cost? Would we have likely already figured out alternatives to oil? Further, both our economic and political systems here in the United States are set up for the short term rather than the long-term view. Corporations make decisions based on quarterly profits, not some abstract 20-year down the line type of thinking. Similarly, politicians are focused on the next election cycle, which may be months or a few years at most. Our values and how we view the world and our place in it affects how we interact with other people, other organisms, and the environment in general. Further, what we ultimately view as right and wrong is affected by our values and worldview. Value systems, worldviews, and ethical principles vary from culture to culture and change over time, and they dramatically affect resource depletion and pollution issues. How would you characterize the United States' current dominant culture in terms of values and worldview? A student a couple semesters ago argued that if people were better informed, our society would be dramatically different. Another student asked, why is the media silent? Good question. Perhaps it has to do with who owns the media companies and how few of them there actually are. Perhaps there's a political issue at the base, as these media companies are essentially given the public airways to make their money. How do we get media companies to serve the public interest? And who decides what is the public interest? Often students argued that we would all be doing more to live sustainably if we were just better informed. Obviously, I agree at some level, as I've decided to teach environmental science. But why is it that our society, even compared to other similar societies in Europe, has such a low level of environmental literacy? Your text highlighted 3 different social traps: the tragedy of the commons, time delay, and sliding reinforcer. These social traps are all examples of decisions that seem good in the short term, but harm society in the long term. All 3 of the social traps listed are quite interesting, and likely often result from failures of our economic and political systems to look further ahead than quarterly profits or the next election cycle. Look back over these 8 underlying causes of environmental issues that we've listed. We've just barely touched on each one of them. I encourage you to think in more depth on them on your own, and perhaps come up with additional causes. In our next section, we'll deal with one of the social traps, the tragedy of the commons.